Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews. Today we're beginning to look at Hebrews chapter 5. Now the last part of chapter 4, as we saw in the last couple of sessions, the author reminds us that Jesus is our great high priest. He is our great high priest. Now it begins to talk a little more about our understanding of that ministry of Jesus as our high priest. Let's begin by looking at the first 4 verses of chapter 5. Now, every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. That is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. Now, no one takes this honor to himself, but he receives it when he was called by God, just as Aaron was. And these first 4 verses, he's talking about the high priest of the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. He is a man from among us. He, of course, is of the tribe of Levi, and he's of the family of Aaron. For Aaron's family always serves as priest. Now, one of the priests is chosen to be the high priest. Notice it says he represents the people in matters related to God. The role of a priest is to stand between the people and God. He sort of represents the people to God in terms of intercessory prayer, but he also represents God to the people in terms of giving the messages of God. And of course, part of that standing between the people and God is the offering of sacrifices. We know when we read in the book of Leviticus all the different sacrifices that were part of tabernacle worship and then, of course, later temple worship. And so the priest would oversee that work. Preeminently, the high priest would be the overseer of the sacrifices of the people to God to maintain their worship of God. That's the ministry of the priest, of the chief priest. Notice he says the chief priest understands the people because he's one of them. He knows their weaknesses because he shares in their weaknesses. Thus he is able to sympathize with them. But also, the chief priest has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people because he, like them, is a sinner. Now, we talk about Jesus, however, his high priesthood is much greater because he is one of us. That is, he has become fully God, so he understands what it is to be human because he became human. Jesus was the Son of God, but he was also the Son of Man, fully God and fully man. But Jesus was without sin. Jesus was without sin. So different from the other chief priest of the Old Testament, Jesus has no sacrifice to make for his own sins, for he was without sin. Therefore, he can present his own blood as the perfect sacrifice for our sins. Now, the author of Hebrews is moving toward that point, but I just want to go ahead and bring it out to you now. So Jesus is the great high priest because he is without sin. And so his sacrifice of his own blood can be the perfect sacrifice for our sins. He goes on, verse 5. Now, in the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest. No high priest ever did. He was appointed by God. Jesus was sent by the Father to be the high priest. God said of him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." Now that is in verse 5, and it's a quote from the 2nd Psalm, a messianic psalm. When the Messiah comes, God had said through the psalmist, "He will be my son. I will be his father." He will come as the Son of God, appointed by the Father to become human, to become fully human, still being fully God, and to become a priest, that he might minister to the people on behalf of the Father and by the sacrifice of himself bring the people back to God. So all the former chief priests, the ones in the Old Testament, the role of the priest was prophetic of the perfect priesthood that Jesus would bring. And what those priests did in the Old Testament, that sort of pointed to the day when the great high priest would come, the very Son of God, to make the perfect sacrifice for our sins. And when Jesus came, Psalm 2 is fulfilled in him. "You are my son. I have become your Father. I am your Father. So Jesus comes as the Son of God, the perfect high priest, to make atonement for our sins. There's more to come. There's more in Hebrews 5, but we'll look at that in our next session together. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews.